welcome to Finding Your Flock, Accelerating Research Through Disease Community Collaborations. So this session was truly born out of feedback. So last year at this conference, we had a couple of sessions, one in particular that really highlighted an ongoing collaborative natural history study at Children's Hospital of Colorado, which Scott is going to talk about a little bit. And then there were a couple of others that were really case studies in collaboration between patient advocacy groups and at academic medical centers where they were approaching multiple diseases together. And we got so much feedback around really good questions, I guess, about how can I do that? I don't know where to start. Like, who are my people? If I were to try to do a collaboration like that, what would it look like? Who would the organizations be that I would approach? How do I know even what kind of academic institutions would be open to such a thing? You know, people just felt like, I like the idea, I have no idea how to get started. So what we've done is today we're going to talk through some examples of collaborations and try to get your juices flowing thinking about collaborative opportunities. And then this afternoon we're going to have a networking session where we have table hosts, and we will all be available, and many others who we've recruited in the room from our Research Advisory Council and our Scientific Advisory Board, and other friends and supporters who will be there to answer your questions and just help you think through some ideas and some possibilities of partnership. So first, I think maybe I should have you each introduce yourselves. So Eric, do you want to get started?
Sure. My name's Eric Sid. I'm a program director with the National Institutes of Health for the NIH. I work specifically within the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, also known as NCATS. NCATS is a home for rare diseases research at NIH. We do a lot of work within there, and I'm part of our division of rare diseases research innovation. So our focus is on the field of rare diseases as a whole. You'll hear from a couple more of my colleagues later today, as well as our director, Joni Rutter, in the evening time as well. My programs specifically focus a lot on trying to look at commonalities amongst different rare diseases, and I'm particularly interested in how we then bring that into information that you can use as both public health information, but also information to help you in your advocacy work and helping then develop your research portfolios.
I'm Scott Demarest. I'm a pediatric neurologist at Children's Hospital of Colorado. I do neurogenetics research and clinical care with a variety of rare disease groups, and I am the clinical director for our Precision Medicine Institute at the hospital level as well, so wear a few different hats.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jillian Shaw. I'm a scientific advisor at the Broad Institute. I'm a neuroscientist by training. My first love was studying the link between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, and then from there went on to study Fragile X syndrome. At the Broad Institute, I'm helping a lot of institute members, including Anna Greca, launch this new initiative that I'm really excited to pressure test with all of you today. It's called Ladders to Cures. It's formed on the foundation of you have a diagnosis, now what? What are some of the therapeutic interventions that we could collectively work on together to identify nodal disease biology that affects multiple diseases in parallel? So I'm looking forward to chatting with you more about that.
Fabulous. So I think we might as well just keep going in the same order. So, Eric, I know that the resources that you and your team work to create at NCATS are both focused on, education and support, but also on kind of therapeutic possibilities. So how do you at NCATS think about collaboration between patient advocacy groups, either directly with them or just in-house, how you think about similarities between conditions and how those similarities kind of push progress faster?
Yeah, great question. I'll take that apart in a couple ways. So we're the Center for, NCATS is the Center for Translational Science. Translational science is looking at the bottlenecks that basically prevent research from progressing. So how do you go from research that's occurring in a lab, maybe with animal models, to research with humans then to a drug to actually clinic? We care about those intersections. And when we talk about the different types of rare diseases, The reason why we focus on rare diseases as a translational science center is because in common, they all face issues with trying to progress research across these different stages. One of the most major critical issues and commonalities amongst rare diseases is that they're rare. Because of the fact that the population sizes are smaller, that makes it a lot harder to pursue different research efforts sometimes, either to get the attention, the funding, the resources that you're going to need, the types of clinical trial readiness that you need in terms of infrastructure to be able to pursue different types of therapy development, or to be able to actually get the statistical power so that the results coming from that research have meaning. So when we talk about different approaches that we try to basically encourage and promote within the rare disease space, oftentimes we are very heavily speaking towards engagement between researchers and the patient advocacy organizations themselves. Because one, every voice matters. Every person in a small population is necessary to get the information to really understand a disease. You know, the difference between having 12 people, I think as Karmen was saying earlier, versus 120 people is notable. Patient advocates are the only ones that have the connection to the community to both drive and create that success, but also it doesn't make sense to pursue research in a disease if you don't really understand the patient voice, their needs, their issues. So a lot of what we do is focused on creating opportunities for engagement, either through scientific collaboration like meetings, or even some of our grants. For example, one of my colleagues over here, Tina Irv, she'll be on a session later today. So she manages the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. As part of the requirement of that grant, we make it so that number one, you can't just work on one disease at a time. So there's 10,000 rare diseases. If we try to do this one disease at a time, we're never gonna get anywhere. So we make it so that the researchers themselves have to work with different rare disease groups. So it requires several different rare diseases. And as a requirement for that, they have to involve patient advocacy organizations. So again, this is critical. It's something that we know is a problem across all rare diseases. And what you bring to the table is not just a strength, it's a necessity for research in rare diseases.
So at the possible expense of giving something away that Tina is going to discuss later, what does that look like for groups that are really interested in those kind of collaborative opportunities? And are they the ones that can help initiate some of those grant opportunities, or is that solely on the physician communities to do?
Yeah, it really depends. And I think a lot of it has to do with the community space that you're in. Do you have a champion, a researcher that is actively promoting, or a group of researchers are actively promoting your disease, trying to push forward research in your disease? Do they need a little bit of a nudge? Do they need patient advocates to help connect them? It really depends on where you're at in your current state. And a lot of this is, again, kind of dependent on that disease space you have. There are different personalities, different individuals involved. So there's no perfect answer to that. But I think a lot of that's kind of looking into your space and saying as an example, again, like how much are researchers really working with you? Do you know who they are? Are you aware of the folks that are actually looking into investigating your disease? And how do you start to build those relationships? Are they on your scientific advisory boards? Are you connected to them so that you're aware of when they have clinical trials? By the time that we are talking about programs such as the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, a lot of the questions that you have to ask first and foremost of just how to create those relationships are starting to mature to the point where now when we're thinking about opportunities, the researchers understand they need partners. So from our stance, we try to make it so that, again, we're defining these as requirements in our grants. But I think from your stance, it's really about where you are in your disease space. Going back to Karmen's question, if you feel like you're able to identify those folks and you build relationships, you have them already, and you're just really, it's again, kind of then teasing this along, it's really dependent on you.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue for Scott. And Scott, I think there are a couple of different ways that we've talked about before that patient communities can collaborate with each other and with academic groups. But to me, certainly the current combined natural history study ongoing is a great place to start. So can you tell us a little bit about that and a little about the collaboration behind it?
Sure. So the natural history study really comes from a combined research clinical approach that we take at our institution. for a couple of different diseases. The one that I'm in charge of is for a multidisciplinary clinic that really brought together 4 rare disease groups that were willing to collaborate, willing to work with each other as well as with our institution to be able to provide the level of scale necessary in a rare disease to set up a program that supported them. So that's STXBP1, Project 8P for chromosome 8P disorders, Ring 14, and SLC6A1. And those who are scientists in the room might be like, well, why the heck those 4? Like, what do they have in common? And that's totally fair. From a biological perspective, they don't necessarily have a huge amount in common. They do have a similar range of manifestations in terms of what kinds of issues those patients have to deal with. And that meant that we can provide a similar team across those 4 disorders and still meet the needs of the patients. So we have a multidisciplinary clinic with 11 providers that see the patients over 2 days. We give them really comprehensive care. We have a highly structured process, and that allows us to not only ensure that we're providing high quality care, but also to develop data alongside that. We joined with RareX as a data platform to help us do this, and that allowed us to say, well, what can we get from our in-person visits from the clinician perspective, but how can we also combine that with parent report data from the RareX platform and really meld those 2 together for the best of both worlds. I think it's a nice example of what you can do when you collaborate. No one of those rare diseases would we have been able to bring the resources to bear by itself to be able to set up that type of program. But coming together, they combined resources, we could combine our efforts so that we could meet those needs. And actually, very quickly, we saw there was more demand than we initially planned for. We had to expand the clinic frequency, things like that. And that's a sign that it's working well and starting to scale to what Sid was recommending here. You have to be thinking about more than just one. You got to think about how do you scale this and expand.
Yep. As you know, I love this model. I would love to do it with 10 more institutions. I think that
We should.
It's sure, just as long as you don't have to lead them all, right? Yeah. So I think one of the many things that I love about this model is that, I mean, you talked about how none of these alone could have brought the resources into it. But I think it's important to recognize that the resources aren't just financial, right? It's also the people. Yep. So like in some of these rare disease communities, it's very difficult to think about staffing a natural history study if you might only ever get 6 patients in a year show up. But when you're collaborating like this, you can consistently fill a clinic once a month or much more often than that as it grows.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, it's not just financial, it's time, it's effort, it's being able to build at an institution the internal buy-in to set up a program, to resource that program, to have the space physically to do the clinics that you're trying to do. There's a lot that goes into that. And every disease matters and every patient matters, but institutions have to prioritize how they're handling things and what resources they're allocating. And so when you're able to say, no, we can have a bigger impact because this isn't for one disorder, this is for multiple, we have a plan, we're gonna expand this over time, that is more attractive to administrators and others that you also have to bring along with you.
Yeah. So you mentioned that a lot of scientists in the room, clinicians in the room would probably think that that's a crazy group of disorders to put together because I can't think in my mind of how like biologically that makes sense to do together. But I think you beautifully, described why it makes sense in a natural history study and in a clinic to do it that way. I think Jillian, your group is doing kind of the exact opposite in thinking about potential therapeutic avenues in looking at underlying disease biology, even if the diseases don't look alike, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think if you were to characterize our group, we study toxic gain-of-function proteinopathies, but we really started with one very specific rare kidney disease, autosomal dominant tubulointerstitial kidney disease of the MUC1 variety. It's a missense mutation, and it leads to a frameshift version of the protein that when it misfolds, it's in the early secretory pathway, And we used all of the tools and tricks available at the Broad Institute, the drug repurposing library, organoids, patient-derived cell lines, and a lot of computational firepower to identify a small molecule that helps traffic this protein to the lysosome for degradation. It relied on a lot of cargo receptor biology that I'm more than happy to chat about over coffee. But what was interesting was this rare kidney disease wasn't the only disease that shares this biology. It actually has been shown in retinitis pigmentosa, and now we're seeing it in a couple of other toxic gain-of-function proteinopathies. So our thesis right now is very much, what if we are disease agnostic and just use a lot of the tools that have really come online in the last 3 years? So I'm thinking about being able to take patient-derived cell lines or introduce pathogenic variants into cell lines throughout the human body using base editing or prime editing, and then use tools like cell painting to look at mislocalization phenotypes that are occurring in these cell lines, and then see what happens when you administer a drug repurposing library. Can you correct that phenotype? With the understanding that maybe there will be some biology that we can uncover that is shared across diseases that we might not necessarily have thought of in the first place, but the microscopes, the computational analysis, using single cell sequencing data sets, that all helps us to identify these nodes where disease pathogenesis is converging.
So I think our marketing team should take the recording of what you just said and turn it into a 5-page blog where they define every word that people don't understand. It's okay because that's your job. Like, that's what we need people doing. But so, yeah, this is amazing to me, right? That you start in this kidney disease. Now you're looking at diseases as disparate as retinitis pigmentosa, a condition that's a degenerative condition of the photoreceptor cells. That was mine. Bad on me. Of the rod and cone cells in the retina, and so can you segue and talk a little bit about ladders to cures and how you're thinking about kind of scaling this a little bit?
So after we made this discovery, we put out a call to arms in, at this point, the Boston community, but we hope to have input from everyone far and wide. But the thesis again was, who has identified other nodes? And it led us to a researcher named Vamsi Mutha, who I know a number of you in the audience work with, who's looking at mitochondrial disorders. And he's like, well, I have a therapy that I'm trying to develop that works for an abundance of mitochondrial diseases. So we brought him into the organization. And then we kind of broadly defined nodal biology as you are trying to solve a problem that applies to multiple people. So for example, people who are interested in cell delivery, so actually getting your payload of interest to the right target. Can we converge and bring in players from biotech and players from the FDA to come have a conversation and problem solve with us? And so Ladders to Cures is very much, it shouldn't be that patient advocacy groups have to fund their own initiatives to create a lot of these data sets, that we as scientists should be creating and making open access for the community. And I'm talking about biomarker discovery, I'm talking about databases where we've de-risked some of the biology, created some of the models, made them open access, and then shared them with the entire community. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to do, but basically, if I were to summarize, it's matching the rare disease experts with all of the tool builders to converge on specific therapies that could apply for multiple diseases simultaneously.
So I imagine that many people out here heard what you just said and are like, sign me up. Like, we need a biomarker. Like, my disease needs a biomarker. We've heard this over and over again, so can I just go to the Broad and sign up? Like, what does this look like to collaborate with the Broad? Is this an open opportunity? Is this something that you have to build before you're ready to, I don't know, accept applications?
Absolutely. So currently we have been having these massive brainstorming sessions with hundreds of individuals, and at this point we are open to all ideas. We want to hear from you. Our website is going to be launching in September. It's Ladders to Cures. Broad Institute will get you there, so please do come contact us. It's very early stage, but we're hoping to develop a pipeline of projects that we'll be supporting.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that's really great. And we've been talking about ways that we can work together, right? In sort of the data that we're collecting from patient communities and how that can kind of feed in to some of what you're doing. I think I forgot to bring the clicker. I should probably go grab it. So what I wanted to make sure to do was walk through a couple of these case studies. I'm just going to go grab it.
Oh, they did it for you.
Oh, they're going to do it for me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. So we've shared, thank you, Rachel. So each of them has shared some examples, and plus I can just, I guess, say it, and they'll take care of it for me there, because here we are. So Scott just talked through this use case at the Children's Hospital of Colorado. At RareX, we are working together to build several different consortia. So I think this is also a great model where we think about shared symptoms, right? So there's difference between shared symptoms and shared biology. So we currently have 8 different patient advocacy groups, a couple of which are represented here in this room today, that are in rare genetic disorders of vision loss, but of different underlying causes, right? So some of those are inherited retinal disorders with very early childhood onset. Some are degenerative retinal disorders where some individuals don't begin losing their vision until mid-adulthood. And some are optic nerve disorders. So biologically quite different. But the symptoms are very similar, and the needs for developing and testing therapeutics are quite similar. So, for example, one of the needs in this group of conditions is better outcome measures. There have been a couple of failed clinical trials in this space where a lot of clinicians believe that the therapy worked, which is heartbreaking. And it's because we don't have good enough outcome measures. But it's very difficult for any one individual rare disease community to take on an outcome measure problem alone. So we're working to do it together. Another example that I threw on here, and I think that there's a little bit of like Google Slides too, like the conversion, it got cut off, but I think you can see it. I think many, many people in this room are familiar with the Every Life Foundation and the amazing work that they do. And this is a perfect example of where you say, okay, across early childhood onset rare disorders, can we work together to raise a collaborative voice for legislative change, right? So it's not all about therapeutic research when we think about collaboration. I'm going to walk through these, and then I'm just going to get some kind of feedback from the group. So the flip side, as we talked about, is shared biology. So there are, I'm familiar with a couple of groups in rare childhood onset epilepsies where the underlying defect is related to the same kind of problem. These are defects in a sodium channel, and they're doing things like a shared drug repurposing screen. They're doing things like trying to develop better assays or tests of how you test function in an animal model or in a cellular model. So when you're doing that kind of work, it makes a lot of sense to try to find the groups that really share that underlying disease biology with you. I think the National MPS Society is another really, really great example. Their research broadly supports research in lysosomal storage disorders and the mucopolysaccharidoses in particular. But they develop and share those resources among all of the disorders and really share potential therapeutic approaches and ideas and share clinical trial design. So, this is an area where it just makes so much more sense for them to come together than approach it all individually. Now, the last two are quite different, but this afternoon, when we talk about matching, there are some individuals in this room who are very newly diagnosed. Their loved one is very newly diagnosed. They're early on this journey. There are some that are a little farther along in this journey, but maybe they have kind of gotten to that point of thinking about starting a 501(c)(3) and kind of need some support. So there are multiple opportunities where you're just kind of in the same place on your journey as other advocates and other groups. And Charlene mentioned this yesterday, actually, in her intro. She mentioned that right after her daughter's diagnosis, she came to the Global Genes Conference. She met some individuals who ended up becoming her cohort. and they supported each other, and they kind of were on that same journey of starting a patient advocacy organization in different diseases, but kind of on that path together. We do something very similar when we onboard groups onto the RareX platform. So we bring them on in classes, and that class has nothing to do with symptoms or biology, nothing. It is like, you're ready to start doing this data collection, but we onboard them as class. They make friends, they support each other, they share resources about how you reach out to the community. I think some of you probably heard Debbie at the UPenn Orphan Disease Center talking about the $1 Million Bike Ride and the work they're doing there to really help organizations to make sure that they maximize their fundraising and put it in the right place. So that's another one where those organizations are very different. And CZI has a program as well. And then the last kind of category that we've put together is the kind of the love and support. And so some of you submitted a request for matching, and you'll get, like you probably already received, a little card with some matches of who your match might be. And one of those is just essentially who in this room is geographically closest to you. If you wanted to get together and have coffee with somebody and talk about living the life of a rare disease family, we'd like to help support that. So kind of, those are 4 broad categories. I think I'm gonna move it beyond that. So I won't go any further, that's fine. So I'm gonna lay it out to the 3 of you. Like, when you think about these different opportunities for collaboration, are there big ones that we've missed? There are many, right? There's so many more beyond this. Are there big ones that we've missed when you think about somebody who is kind of newer in this journey and think about how they get started? Any advice, tips?
I mean, your flock's in this room, right? That's why you're here, right? That you find your flock at meetings, and by engaging, talking with other groups, and realizing that there are some common opportunities to work together. And it may be that different parts of this overall ecosystem, you have different collaborators or different groups that you work with. And we're talking about this a lot in terms of foundations. I don't think it's isolated to foundations. At the academic level, I collaborate with lots of other institutions and other providers. Rare disease, everything you accomplish that's meaningful happens through collaboration. That's just how it works. So whether you're talking about the biologic basis and a certain group of collaborators because it's all about having a particular unique skill in the lab that's relevant for a couple of disorders, or you're talking about clinical symptoms and how we measure those symptoms, how we develop that natural history data or clinical trial readiness. I would even posit that for our industry partners in the room, there's collaboration in a pre-competitive manner at the industry level where you can jointly de-risk certain rare diseases by helping to support basic knowledge that ensures success in clinical trials when you actually have a successful drug, as you alluded to. That's kind of the worst case scenario when it works, but the trial fails.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that by saying, I think a lot of this goes back to yourself, asking yourself, what are the needs and goals that you have right now for your community, for your organization? So if your organization is trying to, let's say, address mental health challenges with the diagnosis, and for your disease, it's a disease that affects children, and it's terminal. And there's a lot of just difficulty in managing that process of diagnosis. It may not matter what symptoms the other diseases that you might be looking towards to have. What might matter more is that they're similarly affecting a same population and the same issue of at this diagnosis point, here are the concerns I have as a parent. You might be thinking more that I'm in the process of trying to develop a natural history study. So I want to look at the groups that are working with researchers like Scott and others, because I want to know how you started that route. Where were you when you were in my place? Did you have a population that's only 50 people in the US? And how did you start to work together and collaborating on a natural history study when everyone's distributed across the nation? What were the steps you took for that? Again, that might be a case where you're really focusing in on particular diseases or groups that have gone through the steps that you're about to walk through. So it's really about asking the right question. What is it that you have as a need? What are your goals? And making sure that you have the right advisors, the right scientific medical experts to help say, yeah, this is where there's an opportunity. Or Global Genes, who else can I talk to? What are other organizations that are similar to mine, have gone through this issue? Where else can I find someone that can help me understand what to do now?
And the one additional point I want to make is sometimes you have to build the database, the organization that you want to exist. And that came out when we were collaborating with Global Genes and RareX, where we were brainstorming one day just how great would it be if there was a really user-friendly database where you would go on sort of like Nomad or ClinVar, where you could type in your variant of interest and then you would have matching that would tell you, these are the researchers who are working on it. These are, this is the current status of clinical trial recruitment. This is the shared biology with other disorders that you might want to learn from. These are some case studies, but just aggregating that database. And then in speaking to additional people, you begin to meet software engineers who are really good at aggregating data and building these databases, and yet maybe they haven't thought about it in the context of rare disease before. So when you ask a question of, this is a problem that I would like solved with some urgency, all of a sudden people begin to coalesce around the problem. And when, in our case, the computational folks begin to have conversations with the rare disease advocates, then you start to actually put some prototypes of databases together.
Yeah, such great thoughts. Okay, I promised time for questions. I feel certain there are going to be questions. I think there will probably be people walking around. There's one. Here comes Pam. Give her a minute. Okay, there's one back here, I think. One over here.
We may not be the best people to point. The lights are a little bright, actually.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Do you think these are mutually exclusive? Like, as an organization, you have to pick one way or another? Is this something that you need, do you need to go? So I'm saying, do we need to invest in both as an organization? Do we need to invest in separate strategies? Is one better than the other for a certain type of organization? What would be your thoughts on that?
Anybody want to take it?
I would say it's not an either or. There's different pieces that have to kind of move forward to really make change, right? And for many, that's how do we get to better quality of life, better outcomes? Part of that is about how do we get to better treatments? How do we utilize the tools that we have better and make sure they're implemented? How do we better understand what happens over the course? Those are all sort of different things that can happen in parallel. And some of that for a particular organization is what's the resource constraint, right? How much resources do we have, and how do we strategically utilize that for what is most pressing for our organization and our community right now? But if there are the resources to be able to say, well, we actually want to push this forward a little bit and this, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive at all. I think, and you may have different collaborators in different spaces, and that's also a good thing. That's reasonable and appropriate.
Yeah, I think it's priority, right? So it's thinking about what you need to prioritize right now as an organization or as a patient community. It's also thinking about opportunity. So are the individuals in that space open and receptive to collaborating? Do you have connections with them? Are you able to meet them somewhere where you can also not just be part of the conversation, but start being engaged as a partner and really kind of be equal in your collaborations? There's a lot that might go in there that you won't know immediately. And I think a lot of this is just trying to understand, again, going back to your organization, your communities, what's their strategy, what's their focus, what's their need right now?
Hi, I'm Frankie Herrera, and my son was diagnosed with 16p11.2 deletion syndrome when he was 3. And so I'm also a physician, and I've gone through this whole odyssey with him, and he's had decent outcomes. And I wanted to share that with other folks who have the same syndrome. And I'm a one-woman nonprofit who just started. So very much at the budding sort of start of things. Do you have advice for me as far as, or other groups like me, as far as, this is a lot, like what you just shared, it's a lot. It's sort of like the penultimate of where we would want to be. Is there sort of like a stepwise, try this first, and then go to this? You know, I'm sure funding comes into it as well, but any advice on the steps to take?
I think, I think I'll take that. So Global Genes was founded in large part for exactly this, right? That, you know, initially Nicole and others recognized this need across rare diseases to build capacity and to build resources, and everybody shouldn't have to figure out that whole path alone. So Global Genes has an entire set of resources dedicated to this. And I would say there are two places that you and others who very much heard what you just said and felt that can turn within Global Genes. One is our Rare Concierge service. This is something that when I was practicing in clinic, I really wish I had known existed. I don't know why I didn't know it existed. But you know, anybody can reach out to the Rare Concierge service and ask any question. And that can be like, I'm just getting started and I'm not even sure, like, should I start a 501(c)(3), or is that too much work for me to take on as a single individual, and I should put efforts into finding others to just join me first? You know, like all of it, the whole length of the journey, they can help guide and support. And then we have a whole bunch of toolkits. Right? So like if you decide the next thing I'm going to do is try to develop a scientific advisory board. Like we have a toolkit around that, you know, like how would you go about that? And, you know, just answering like some common questions that people have had on that path. Because it's not a general answer. I think it's an individualized answer, and yet there are some common resources that can be shared.
I would also just tack on to that you want to think about it from a few different perspectives. So reach out to other organizations where you do have shared biology, other chromosomal groups, for example. There's certain challenges on the science side of things that are similar across different chromosomal disorders. So pick other people's brain. Who have been trying to do that for a few years in that space or longer. Take it from another perspective of symptomatology. Reach out to other groups that have similar symptomatology. Pick their brain about how do you advance things there, and that can help you to kind of say, like, what's my roadmap need to look like? And yes, how can Global Genes help? But how do you also crowdsource from others in this room that have walked that path a little bit?
Hi, my name is Amanda Murphy. I'm from the DESH Foundation, and I had a question about how do you balance the value of open science with the relationship that a patient advocacy group might have with an academic institution. For example, the doctor who discovered our disorder works with a university, and we're very lucky to have him as part of our scientific board, and they've done a lot for us. But, you know, we're concerned right now that that relationship might be too closed, and if we want sort of a more open, way to get at our data or our tissue samples, how do we balance that relationship with a university, for example, while, hopefully moving forward with a more open science view of our samples?
You're looking at me.
I am. As the academic clinician in the room, or on stage.
Yeah. So I think there's been a big shift in the last couple of decades. Like, it was very common previously that a clinician tried to build their entire career on one or two disorders, and there was a lot of need to be possessive and protective of the data, the samples, and so forth, because that was sort of their academic livelihood. 20 years ago, we knew a few less disorders than we know today in the genetic realm. And so now as an academic researcher, my perspective is there's an overwhelming amount of work. I can't possibly do it all. Why would I ever be possessive of it? Right? I just want it to happen. I want it to get done. There are certain challenges with sort of working with any large bureaucracy like a university, and how can you help that individual to be able to share even if they want to? How can you give them protections that make them not feel vulnerable in that situation? We're sharing our data with RareX. We're putting it into that platform, but they're also working with us to say, like, if there's certain parts of this that you need to have protected so that you get first dibs on kind of using that, that's great. They're willing to work with us that way. For my purpose, it's actually because they're not validated tools yet, and I don't want them to be used inappropriately, more than I'm concerned about who's getting credit for it and things like that. But I think you just openly and honestly deal with it, and you have your needs as an organization, and that includes being able to sort of democratize access to knowledge, samples, expertise, data, and you have to support that.
So I was going to add to that by saying that I think there's two parts to this when you're talking about data stewardship, because part of it is you aren't just coming in here with a request, you're coming in here with a strength. Your connection to the community and the trust the community has in you as an organization then means that in order for data to be constructed, you have to have participants. So part of the question here when you're talking to organizations that want to create these systems is, ultimately, who's the owner of this information? And if the issue for your community is they would trust as an owner of their data, the organization, and you as the organization would have the responsibility to continue to promote and basically grow the data set. Again, it's not just you coming in and saying like, hey, we want to take this over and it's all of an ask, this is not all the request from us. We can also offer something too. We have an equal role in this, we're partners in this. And I think that's part of the discussion, is how to really help the researchers also understand that you're gonna help them succeed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if I could add to that a tiny bit, that example that I gave during the Open Science Data Challenge of talking about like the natural history of 14 versus the 120, 140 on our platform, that should be very appealing to that researcher. Yeah. Like, we want to extend your research beyond the individuals who have the resources and the capacity to get here in person. So how can we do that effectively?
And the last thing I would say is the other shift that's happened in the last 20 years is all of this, right? Research is actually driven by advocacy groups, by RARE partners. It's not driven by a clinician who's sitting in an office going like, oh, I'm interested in this, And so you have power in that. You have agency, and you can push your agenda and help support the direction that you're going with it. And we're now shifting to that idea that patients own their data, right? That's how it ought to be. It's not owned by a university or by a clinician who has helped to support it. We're stewards of data, and we need to be responsible in making sure that it's being used.
Yeah. I think we're out of time. I'm supposed to announce where you're going next, which is up here. First of all, I want to heartily thank all three of you for coming, for sharing your wisdom, for being available later today.